Anyhow, so thank you, Linda, for your introduction. I was real thrilled when she asked, well, we were talking about topics, and I said, well, I could do propagation. And we went from a huge hands-on idea for all of you to get your hands dirty to me just standing here and talking. Sorry, we'll have to do a workshop on propagation, which I know you've done in the past. Debbie Boyle has done a workshop in the greenhouse at the Grapevine Botanic Garden, and thank you. So today I wanted to talk about propagating, and probably not to the extent that you will walk out here as an expert, but maybe you'll walk out of here with some cool ideas and new challenges for your propagation. And I know all of you, because you're a member of the Grapevine Garden Club, all of you are interested in more plants. And that's what propagation is all about, is plants and more plants. And so I want to say propagating plants and cultivating friendships, because that is one of the things in my groups, Master Gardener and Garden Club, that the sharing of our plants probably brings me the most satisfaction. And my dear friend Barbara Munn and I and Pam Brock and a number of people in this room have shared plants, and I think I get the most satisfaction out of that. So I'm going to go back to a little history on propagation. I'm not going to dally on this very long, but it is really interesting that there was two really critical cross-pollinations that happened in 8000 BC. It was one of the first documented propagations or cross-pollinations that happened that really set the tone for the next 10,000 years. And that was for wheat, bread wheat. And there was a strand of goat wheat and grass that crossed, and then another strand of wild grass, and that crossed, and then the final product was a harvestable bread wheat that then went on to provide for our human race for the next 10,000 years. And the really neat thing about that is that it happened naturally, and that people could witness it. They witnessed the happening of it, and they could tell in their fields that the wheat was beginning to get easier to harvest. The kernels were bigger on the stem. The wheat stood straight up and didn't blow away when they cut the stem. So there were things that they actually witnessed, and they went back and researched why this had happened. So that was really phenomenal. The other thing that happened in the next 10,000 years, there's more types of propagation. So we have things like in 4000 BC, the Romans dipped unrooted stems in ox manure because they realized it was a great rooting hormone. Don't think I would like to be doing that today, but I'm sure people could. 2000 BC, grafting olive trees was really popular, became popular. The Chinese were the first to do a layering propagation, and then the Romans started layering grapes, and thank God they did, because we have lots of grapes for wine and we love that. And then vegetative methods for reproducing bulbs and such popped up. And so for 10,000 years, because we're in year 2000, so from 8000 BC to now, 10,000 years of techniques. So where does that get us? To the Victorian age, and that's where propagation really took off. It was a hobby. It was where every estate had a beautiful greenhouse on it, where people were traveling to hoard plants and to where species were being identified and hybrids were being identified, mostly in the more houseplant type plants, or your roses or your begonias or your African violets or whatever. So really huge. It became a hobby. It became something that we could do in our homes. And then there was the introduction of cold frames. And in a cold frame is like a greenhouse, but it's outside of the greenhouse. It's more for hardening off your plants, which we're going to talk about. But they would line the bottom of their cold frames with manure for the heat, because there was no other way to provide heat to the seedlings. But they didn't plant the plants in the manure. That would have burned the roots. But they used the manure to provide the heat. And so that was kind of neat. And then that gets us to today, where we have newer modern methods of propagation. And these are a lot of which are being done in the labs. I don't know if any of you all have gotten to hear Dottie Woodson speak on propagating orchids. She is a retired extension agent from Fort Worth and Dallas, and she has a huge hybridizing orchid greenhouse on the west side of Fort Worth, and she propagates orchids. And if any of you all have ever read about that, it is a unbelievable task. Nothing that I'm going to think you all will walk out of here today willing to go try to do. But anyhow, all of it's done in jars. It's done with spores. It's done very microscopically. And that is where we are today. They are actually engineering seeds from plant tissues. They're just doing, they're forcing radical to start to emerge, and then they're freezing them before they send the seeds out. So they're making our seed packets that we get and delivered to us. They're making those very viable, where your chance of germination is very, very high. Whereas collecting seeds in the wild, we may not get that. So that's all really interesting. Who knows where this is going to go? And obviously this technology spills over into our own healthcare and things that they can do with our tissues. So anyhow, I just wanted to bring you up to date on propagation and where we were 10,000 years ago and where we are today. And then next month it'll even be different. So how do plants propagate in nature? Well, we are all aware of sexual propagation. Obviously most of us have it, but that's not how the plants do it. So anyhow, so the sexual propagation is where there's male and female reproductive parts either on the same plant or on the same flower or in the same garden. And so different types of plants have different setup. One of the most popular, though, is for a plant to have both the male and female in the flower, and that's really true to our lilies and such. So you have all the different pieces of the it's not going to work. So this is really where the seed develops right here. And I know that's a little blurry, but I think you've all probably seen this diagram before. But the pollen comes off of the anther. And what's interesting about plants, most all of them have a safeguard built in to where the pollen off of this flower actually doesn't pollinate this flower. It pollinates the one next to it because of our bees and butterflies and things like that. So maybe the ovary isn't ripe in this flower when the pollen is ripe on the anthers. And so, but it is ripe, the ovary's ripe in the next flower. Because bees are not that smart. They're not going to know, hey, I've got to stay away from this female part because she doesn't want my pollen. So anyhow, but it's real interesting. I learned that. That's not something I had probably been taught before. So just because you have both parts present in the flower doesn't necessarily mean that that pollen is going to pollinate that female. So then we have asexual reproduction, and this is how it happens in nature. And then we will talk more about how asexual propagation and how we influence it and make it happen without with human input. So there's natural layering, things like forsythia, some jasmines, where the stem falls down on the ground and roots develop at a node along the length of the stem, and it sets roots, and then you eventually get another plant from that. Offshoots or suckers, we have a lot of that, especially with yopons and nandinas and things like that. Maybe not the most sought after plants, but can be your worst enemy, your best friend. It all just depends. It's funny, you could have a sucker as a best friend. So I probably have one. So bulbs create offsets off of the bulb, and so you get lots of little offsets. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a pregnant onion. I have several in my garden house, and they get the little offsets, the little baby onions. Corms create cormals. I don't know who came up with that word, but that's kind of cute. And rhizomes create segments, and you know that from irises and things. And then there's stolons and grasses and such, where the stolon travels underground. And I have just a couple of pictures here. So this is actually an elephant ear bulb that I pulled out of the ground or out of a pot right before the freeze, and you can see there's an offset right here getting ready to form. I don't know that this is going to survive. It's in my garden house, but I knew it probably wasn't going to survive in the pot during the winter, so I just ripped it out of the ground, out of the pot. And then this is a dwarf mondo grass. Not the tiny little mondo grass, but like just a regular. And this is like a stolon here. You can see where it's come across and created another bunch of grass. So those are all how it happens in nature. And so we're going to talk a little bit about sexual propagation. There are 3 types, as we talked about. Help me out, Pam. Who knows that word? I had to call my daughter in college and say this word for me. Dioecious, I don't know. Anyhow, I have dyslexia, guys, so I have a reason. I'm almost 60 years old, and I can't pronounce anything. So that is where the male and female flowers are not on the same plant. So I don't know if any of you all are familiar with the ginkgo tree. The Master Gardeners in here are male and female ginkgo trees. The male does not produce a fruit. That is the one you want in your garden. The female produces a fruit, and as it rots, it smells like manure. So if you're a farm girl, you might want that one. But if you're a regular gardener who likes to sit on their back patio, you do not want the female. You want the male, and that most of the nurseries only sell the males. But there's the mulberry trees and junipers, and here's a picture right here of a female juniper. And it can be a little misleading with your junipers when you look at them, because sometimes the young corn, acorns, or seed pods can appear to be a fruit of some sort. So it's not as easy to tell. How many of you all have yopons in your yard that don't berry? I have. What's interesting, and I don't know how this happened, but I have a yopon that has multi-trunks, and one side of it, 2 trunks, berry, and the other side that doesn't berry. And what's interesting about that is it appears they came from the same base. But what I think really happened is somebody put 4 stalks in a pot, and they sort of fused together, because it's not like it has a trunk and then separates. It comes right out of the ground separated. So obviously half male, half female, but I think that was done by human nature. And monoecious plants, this one's kind of neat. They have a separate male flower and a separate female flower. Again, going back to the slide where we were talking about that type of plant. And bisexual plants, those are the ones where they have the stigmas and the antlers and not antlers, not like a deer. So don't go out looking for antlers on your plants. anyhow, so this one's neat. I don't know how many of you all have noticed this in your garden if you have hellebores. This is your flower that you typically see, a little beautiful little flower, and this is when it's pregnant. Have any of y'all noticed the pregnant hellebore? It's so much fun. Once you know the reproductive process for the hellebore, you get out there and you're looking for your pregnant flowers, so it's kind of fun. You set up a little nursery for them, and then you wait till they're ready to bust open and you collect the seeds. And then you scatter them. I scatter them immediately on the ground because, and we'll get into that later because I'm not much of a seed starter, but I have, nature will scatter them, but then I scatter them. And there's thousands of seeds and only a few come up. But anyhow, that's kind of fun. And then this is your cucumber. And it has a male flower and a female flower. So you can see here, now you're all going to go out there this spring and you're going to look at your cucumbers. You're actually going to go plant cucumbers just so you can see this. So, because I'm almost 60 years old, didn't know this either. So the cucumber forms here where the ovary was in the female plant, and then the male flower doesn't have such a thing. And then these little spikes that are on your cucumbers, they're there when it's young, so it keeps the caterpillars and the slugs and stuff off of the fruit. Isn't that funny? So if you've ever grown cucumbers, when they're mature, they may still have some of those spikes on them. And you're like, why do they have these spikes? Well, that's what they're for. So again, I taught you something. So anyhow, so let's talk more about human propagation and our influence into propagation. And one of the biggest things that we've all get excited about in propagating, and when we're successful with it, are heirloom plants. Plants that came from our great aunt's house or our grandmother's house, or even your parents' house, and or your best friend, like Pam. And we all wanted to dabble a little bit in propagation for that reason. So how many of you all have a plant in your yard that came from a parent or a relative's yard? Okay, and so who in here has one that's probably 50 years old? Oh, you do? Dinah, what is it? Okay, so she's saying daylilies. Her grandfather cross-pollinated daylilies and grew those. So there's a great example. Who was another person with 50? What do you have, Mary Lou?
Red flower.
A red flower. All right. Woo! Turk's cap. All right, Turk's cap. That's I didn't plant flowers 50 years ago, so I don't know how long Turk's cap lives, but I guess it could, and so that's awesome. But anyhow, and that's probably those plants when you walk through your garden are the ones that you're bring back great memories and you enjoy seeing come to life every spring, or cut the flowers off of, or this and that. It always brings back a great memory. So that's what kind of gets us to where we are with propagation today in our homes. So we have a seed swap here, and I wanted to take a minute and look at that list and talk to you a little bit about seeds and collecting seeds in the wild. So we collect seeds out of our own garden and bring them here, and they label them and they package them for us, and it's really sweet. But collecting the seeds is really important. Collecting them too early, they're not going to germinate. Collecting them too late, they're not going to germinate. Storing them, say you went and you collected some seeds last fall and you've kept them in your glove box of your car, or they fell between the seats and we've had freezing weather. Most likely those seeds are not going to germinate. They're exposed to vulnerable conditions. prior to being harvested. So maybe we did have a freeze, and then you went out and said, oh, I'm still going to collect those seeds and I'm going to take them to the seed swap. So I want to tell you that this was something that we realized when we were working in the Grapevine Botanic Garden greenhouse, propagating for Betsy Marsh in the city. And Debbie was here. Debbie Boyle back there was our lead. And we were propagating native plants from seed gathered in the wild. And we thought the first week or two, we put them out there in the seed trays. We had the heating mats, we had the misters, we did everything. We put them just right in the soil. We used the right potting mix. We had clean trays. And maybe one germinated. One, maybe 3 out of 80. You know, it was like, what are we doing wrong? And we were second guessing ourselves. Well, the first week is because they got too wet, because we didn't know how to set the misters. But then after that, we had to resolve to the fact that a 15% germination rate was good, was really good. So if you can imagine, and I love that we do our seed swap, and I think that's great, but be mindful of how you care for your seeds before you donate them. And then be mindful when you leave here with them to make sure that they don't stay in your car and they're stored properly until you use them. But seeds collected in the wild are not going to give you much viability. Yes? Oh, every seed different kind of storage, and we're going to get into that, but most likely a dry, cool condition is the best storage for seeds. Not too hot, not too cold. Some seeds need to be put in the refrigerator, and we're going to get to some of that as well. So just to let you know that that it's okay, just plant more of them and you'll be happy. Plant more. Okay, so here are some ways to store them in plastic containers. Some people take the little desiccant bags that you get in your goods you purchase, your box, you know, electronics, and they'll put those in the Tupperware with them to make sure the moisture stays out. Label them really well, probably put a date on them. Dates are important, labels are important. And then you can do a seed viability test with them. So you can get a wet paper towel, you can put 10 seeds in there, and then you leave them for the duration it takes for germination. And every seed has a different germination rate, but you can find all that information on the internet or in a book. You can or you can go to the store and you can look at a seed packet. Maybe you got the seeds here, but you can take a picture of the seed packet at the store and it'll tell you all the information for your seeds that maybe you collected in the wild. And then if you open that paper towel after that germination period and you see 6 out of 10, then that's a 60%. We're going to do some simple math there. And 60%. If you see 0, then that's 0%. And that can happen, and I'm sorry, but that can happen. So anyhow, but seed viability is important. It does take a couple of weeks to do, not with beans. Beans do it overnight. They're really fast, happy seeds. But so storage is important, viability is important. And then some seeds have to have a scarification process done to them. They have to have a little clip with a nail clippers or a little scrape with a knife or a little bit of sanding done to break that coating on them. And why is there a coating there? Well, it's kind of like you're overcoming their dormancy. And some seeds they don't want to germinate until the next year. They want to just be dispersed on the ground, and they don't want to be germinate. So they want to survive a drought, or they want to survive a winter. So they have a coating on them, and this is all done by nature. And it's kind of interesting if you look at things like mountain laurel seeds. They have a very thick coating on them. And so you're going to scrape that, alter that, so that gives that seed a chance for you to force it. So you're forcing it to grow or germinate prior to when it really wanted to. So that's what overcoming dormancy means. I've heard that term for many years and nobody ever explained it to me like that. So hopefully y'all will know that now. So cold stratification, some seeds really have to see cold weather. They have to see it. That's why we chill tulips, and they need that cold weather. So you put them in a little sand, put them in a baggie, and put them in your refrigerator, and you need to be around 40 degrees. And it'll tell you on a seed packet, or it'll tell you on the internet how long to leave them in there, and you'll have more success like that. So every seed is different. That's why a lot of people who propagate tend to migrate to certain plants because they learn them and they know them, and then they don't do a plethora of plants. People who do vegetables, people who do zinnias do zinnias. We do have several plants on our list that are going to be high germination rate just by the nature of the plant, and we can we'll talk about that again. So best practices for home seed propagation: clean trays, clean lightweight soil. The roots of the plants really enjoy the lighter weight soil, and if you can't use a heavy soil, never use garden soil. Heating mats. Some plants need the heat from the bottom up, some until they germinate, and then they need the light from the top down until after they have their first 2 leaves set. So labeling is important. Community pots is an option, and if you don't want to do trays and your space is limited. Then learning how to bump up the plants, which we're going to talk about in just a second, and then hardening them off. As far as soils go, we use a BM mix. You can get it at Flower Ranch in Keller, and it's a real lightweight potting mix, and honestly I would not use it alone in a potting soil for like plants, garden pots and such. Even though they sell it for that, it's really too lightweight. It dries out very easily, but it's a great seed mix. And then you can make your own with perlite and vermiculite and some type of other thing. There's lots of recipes for seed mixes, and you can research that. So as the plant germinates, then it gets its first 2 leaves, and then maybe starts setting its second and third and fourth leaf. And when you always get a fork, and you get your nicest silver fork. So that, I'm sure you're all going to go do that, because I'm going to tell you it works better that way. It doesn't use anything, but you sort of push the plant up from its roots. Always grab it by the leaf, never grab it by the stem. You grab it by the stem, it crushes the stem and the plant is going to die. So always grab it by the leaf. So once they get to a point where they have leaves and they're under a light, your room temperature has to be really nice. And let me just tell you that as they are germinating, everything I read about different seeds is you have to water them daily or 2 times a day, mist them. And so there's a lot of babysitting with seeds, a lot of babysitting. I don't like to babysit, so I'm not a seed person, but some of you all may really enjoy doing that. So hardening off your seedlings as they get bigger, maybe when they have 7 to 8 to 10 leaves and the stem is really strong, you have to harden your seedlings off before you sow them in the ground. And that is another 1 to 2 weeks after your seedlings have grown. So here we are at the end of January, and we can plant in the ground in April. So we've got 8 weeks. So if you've got 6 weeks to grow inside and 2 weeks to harden off, you need to get going today. So this week is really crucial, and next week is really crucial for starting your seeds, and especially vegetable seeds. So hardening off is really important. It acclimates the seedlings to the outside air temperature, and what I've read here is that some people take their seedlings out in the day under a bush and bring them in at night for a week, and then they leave them out. And I was like, oh my gosh. Wow. Okay, no trips. Don't go on a trip. So that won't work. So therefore, you may want to really pay attention to what really requires hardening off versus what doesn't, and what you're going to get more success with, like cosmos or zinnias or something like that. Things that you can sow right into the ground. But anyhow, hardening off is really important. If you worked really hard to get 24 in a tray, there's no sense in ruining it with the hardening off process to only get 10 to put in the ground. So be mindful of that, and every plant has its own process. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the plants that we have. So we have I picked 3 seeds off of our list. Loofah seeds, those are kind of neat. I don't know how many of y'all have grown some of the loofahs so really cool. So they are not real, they're real prone to transplant shock once you've made a seedling. So that hardening off process is really important for that. So you have to keep it watered once a day. Again, you can't go on vacation. So if you feed your loofah plants every 4 to 6 weeks with a diluted fertilizer liquid, that's good as well. So a good plant to get from seed and to use from here, it's very viable. Gomphrena, and I know that Karen Rice has this in her yard. She's probably the reason we have seeds. And I heard that there's always a shortage of them in the seed industry. So it's always good. So whoever's in charge of seeds, people are going to rush to get your seeds of Gomphrena. Anyhow, again, a fairly easy one to propagate. You're going to start wanting to do that this week or next week. And they can sow into the ground in April. It's just longer to get the plant to grow for you. So it'd be midsummer before it's a really pretty plant, and then we get into the heat. So that's why it's really, a lot of people like to grow them indoors and then put them in the ground. So it's more immediate satisfaction. So anyhow, but that one's a really cool plant as well. And then the desert willow, that's very interesting that it's here. It's a little harder to propagate from seed. It's a lot easier to propagate from a cutting. So you can try it as a seed. Let me see what it says here. Okay, so it says actually to plant the seeds after you harvest them. So if you come to my house or someone's house who has a desert willow, when the seeds, find your friend who has one and go get the seeds then and sow them immediately after you harvest them. So you'll have more success there. So asexual propagations, methods that are not natural. We have the same things that happen in nature, but we force them to happen. So we have division, layering, air layering, cuttings, bulb chipping, fern spores, grafting, whole leaf plantings, part leaf plantings, roots, tissue, you name it. It's been done, it's been tried, and certain plants thrive with certain methods. And here you can see at the top here is a begonia leaf section, which we've taught this in propagation class. It's really fun. And this is what those leaf sections look like after you've babysat them for weeks. And they have little bitty leaves coming out of them. And how many master gardeners in here still have their begonias? They Everybody killed theirs. What? Okay, but you have an African violet, right? Yes. So the African violet's the leaf section, and so look, they chose to kill the begonia and keep the African violet. So so we have division. This is my favorite. It will be your favorite. It obviously is the easiest. So if let's just take a hosta for instance. Most things you can, a lot of things you can propagate by division, even if it's not the best way to do, for the plant. It might not be as healthy for the plant, but you can. So let's take hosta for instance. If they grow big, you can tie a string around them, pull them up and dig them up, clean their roots off, and separate them very meticulously into there's probably 20, 30 plants in this picture here. Or you can do like I do and just put a shovel down the middle of it. That's easy. Shovel it. Yeah. So, and you don't even have to dig the whole plant out of the ground to do that. I don't know what they were thinking here. So, anyhow, and if you're real good, you just, when your friend's out of town and you've gone and taken half her hosta, you can put the soil back the way it was, she'll never know. So let's talk about this one. This one's a great story. These are peonies, and I know Barbara Munn has a beautiful peony. Peonies, a lot of us don't have them. They don't grow as well for a novice gardener as they would for an experienced gardener. Although Barbara will tell you she doesn't do anything, but she does. She says sweet things to it. Well, anyhow, I have a really good friend. Her house burned down, and she was up in Pilot Point. She was a master gardener in Tarrant County and moved up there. Her house burnt down, and I went up to see her the week after because she had a lot of house plants and such that maybe kind of survived. It was in the middle of summer, so most of them were on her patio. So I said, well, I'll take your plants, the ones that were small enough for me to take. And she goes, what about my peonies? Those were my grandmother's. I've moved them 4 times. And they were in behind her bedroom window. And I said, well, let's dig those up. And the dirt was just from the water from the fire department. It was horrible. It was disgusting. We had mud up to our knees. We dug up 5 plants. We threw them in plastic bags. I took them home. I divided them, and I made 14 plants. And they all came up in their pots, and they all bloomed that next year. So I was really proud of myself. But I had to babysit these for 1.5 years for her because finally she got her house rebuilt. And then she came and took them. And it was like giving away a litter of kittens. And you're like, oh, I don't want my babies to go. She goes, well, you can have one. And so let me just tell you, I moved those babies from sun to shade. They're all in pots. And I was like, where are they going to be happiest? And so I didn't want them to get too hot. I didn't want them to get too, they love to be cold in the winter. So when we had the freeze last February, they loved that. Packed the snow on top of them. Maybe that's why they bloomed. But anyhow, I really truly babysat those plants. And I actually babysat several others for her as well. And but that's what friends do. And she got to give half of them to her children at their new home. So that was great. Anyhow, it's a mangled mess. If you've ever seen them, it's just a mangled mess right here. And you can just, everywhere that there's a little flower bud or stem bud, is make sure one of those is present when you're planting it, when you're putting it in a pot. And they only need to be 1 inch below ground on the soil. So 1 to 2 inches. So then layering, my forsythia does this by itself and can be a little frustrating, but this I thought was a really neat idea. This is where you take the stem, you can take a hydrangea, a forsythia, caria, anything that has a long stem on it. You can take a Hoya, a house plant, that type of thing. But I like this idea where you take it and don't just pin it to the ground next to it, but put it in a pot. Pin it to a pot. So all you have to do is cut the stem from the mother when it's viable, and then you have it and take it somewhere else. You don't have to dig it out of the ground. So if you come to my house next year, you're going to see pots everywhere. So they're going to have, I'm going to be layering things in pots. So I thought that was a really neat idea. Air layering, we do this in propagation class. It is with a rubber tree. I don't know why anybody would need 2 rubber trees, but luckily we're not always very successful with this. But it's the easiest one to show, air layering. And air layering is where you remove the outer skin, you expose the cambium layer of the plant, you pack it with moss, and wrap it really tight. Again, you have to water it, keep it wet, and rubber trees don't need a lot of sun. You put them in indirect sunlight, and then you get a root ball like that, and then you cut it below that root ball and put that in a pot. So then you have 2 rubber trees, one with a really nice top on it and one with a cut off top. So anyhow, don't rush out to do this, guys. It's cuttings. That's another great one. If you can't divide, then cut. And so I love cuttings. Let me just talk to you just a little bit about a cutting. This is a magnolia out of my yard, and this works just fine. But when you do a cutting, you're not going to like this, but you need to only leave 2 or 3 leaves on the top of the cutting, and you need to cut them. So it's going to look really ugly when you're rooting it. You're going to dip it in a rooting hormone and see, I have 4 nodes, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if you take the cutting in the morning and don't get to planting it in the afternoon, go ahead and make a fresh new cut right at the bottom. Always make a fresh new cut. You like to do that with anything. And make sure your scissors and everything are sterile. You're going to just dip the end in a rooting hormone, ox manure if you have it. If you don't have it, then sorry. I would not put it in chicken manure. Chicken manure is really high in nitrogen. Anyhow, so this is how you prepare a cutting, and you're going to put it in the soil at least to that 3rd node. You want at least 3 nodes underground. And that's because roots form at your nodes. The roots aren't going to form anywhere along the stem. So when I went out to cut this at my tree, I had to really pay attention to which stem I was going to cut, because sometimes the nodes are this far apart from each other. And if I cut that and I don't have a node on the last 6 inches, and there's just 1 node, and then it's not going to be a viable cutting. So you really want to pay attention to that when you're making a cutting. And a node is where you've pulled a leaf off. So if the leaves are 12 inches apart, that's not a good one. If the leaves are 4 inches apart or 3 inches apart, that's a good one. So it's really important to know that. You're cutting those leaves off because you want the energy to go to the roots and not the leaves. So we don't need those leaves anymore. We're going to get new leaves, and all the energy is going to go to those leaves if you leave them, and the plant's going to have to work harder. And so you'll be more successful when you cut those leaves off. And then division. How are we doing on time? Okay, good. So division is, I took this plant, I have a ZZ plant, and I was really thrilled that there's 4 ways to propagate. Now, all plants have multiple ways to propagate in most cases, okay? Either through a seed or a offset or something like that, or a division. But this ZZ plant can be done by division, by seed, by a leaf cutting, or a stem cutting. Now I have one that has probably 30 shoots on it, so now I'm tempted to go home and I can make some money because they're worth some money. Anyhow, so that's kind of neat. So you have options. So maybe you're at your friend's house and she goes to the restroom and you get a pair of scissors. Take your bigger purse. Take your bigger purse. Don't invite me to your house. So The other thing about cultivating friendships is when you're a master gardener and somebody goes, do you want to start of this? Do you want to start of that? And you can't say no because you really want the plant, but you really don't want to babysit a cutting. You know, you're just like, oh, don't give me that. Don't give me a leaf. Don't give me a stem. Okay, I'll take it. So she shows up at my house with a solo cup with a stem in it. And she goes, here, oh. And I'm like, oh, thank you, thank you. And I put it in the nursery where everything else that she's given me has to be babied. And I'm like, okay. Well, you know, we can be successful if we try. And so this is it now. And it's done really well. And I babied it. But we're in the COVID mode, so we can baby, you know, because we are not going anywhere. So anyhow, I absolutely love Nancy to death. She's given me so many plants. And then this is one. This is a Calancho. And this is pretty much what she gave me right here. She said, oh, I picked this plant up. I want to show it to you. And she opens her car door and a piece falls off. She goes, oh, here, you can have that. Well, lucky for me, those little things right there root. Those are roots. And all you have to do is put them in some soil and, you know, a little bit more than just putting it in soil. You got to make sure it's wet and all that kind of stuff. But we know how to do that. And so, again, I have a plant here, and it blooms so pretty, but it blooms in my garden house in the winter. So I have to go stand in my garden house, which is a lovely place to be. There's only one room right here for me, and there's all the plants, and I get to see the flowering calanchos and stuff. There are a lot of plants in my garden house that only bloom in the winter. So if my husband's looking for me, that's where I am. So anyhow, I brought two of them over here that I propagated. They're going to give us door prizes. So bulbs. Bulbs are easily multiplied when you have, this is a twofer. And you buy bulbs from your garden club or master gardeners, and you open your bag and you get one or two of those, and you're like, oh, it's like winning the lottery. It's awesome. So you just pull those apart and you got two. Oh my gosh, that's so easy. So some people like to do bulb chipping, and I'm not going to say very many people like to do this. There's people who hybridize that probably like to do it. It's a real strenuous process, not strenuous, but labor and tedious process. And so you're actually cutting a really nice bulb, one that you really enjoy, one that maybe you paid $10 for, and you don't want to buy another one at that price. So you always make sure that the roots, their root material on the basal plate is on each section. And then you're going to put those in a fungicide, and then you're going to put them in something else, and then you're going to put them in a bag that keeps what is moist, and then you're going to put them in your daughter's closet where nobody ever goes. And you're going to forget about them and leave them there. And I used to tell that story because my teenage daughter, when she was home, I mean, honestly, her closet was the best place for worm reproduction and everything, you know. So, spore propagation. Okay, now if you're really, really anxious to do propagating, try to propagate a fern. Nancy Curl, Master Gardener, has done this with the help of the Botanic Gardens and had a class on it. And so we were all, took our fern leaves, they had different ferns for us to choose from, and we scraped our spores off onto soil, a really wet, moist soil, and they said, okay, now you baby this again. And you, in a few weeks, you'll see a fuzz, a green fuzz, like a moss. And then you take sections of that and you divide those into bigger containers like this. And then in a few weeks, you're going to see sprouts, and then you're going to take those and divide those. And so this is where this one pot could end up being 1,000 plants. And this is how they do it, guys. This is really how they do it. For me, though, it turned out to be 0 plants. So really tough to do, Needs to be done in a greenhouse environment, but really neat. So can you imagine that one pot could be 1,000 plants? So anyhow, so when you go home and look at your ferns, you know what journey they've been on. Well, anyhow, so let me just tell you, I hope you learned something today, because we just really talked about basic propagation and stuff. But we give this book to our classes when we do propagation at Master Gardeners. We don't give it to them. They pay $200, so it's an expensive book. The book doesn't cost that, but they have to pay $200 to listen to us talk. And so anyhow, this is a great book. It's a really good book. It has a lot of plants listed in it. And so if you're interested in doing trees, grafting, things like that, consider getting a book like this. And also there's the internet. I didn't touch on grafting because I'm not a grafting expert at all. And there's lots of other things I didn't touch on, but we can do that another time.